The Mafia boss thought he owned the city until his maid bought his tower. The city of Ravenna never slept. Its streets pulsed with a kind of nervous energy, the kind that lives in a place where power is not elected but taken, not inherited but seized, and not maintained by law but by fear. And at the very center of that fear stood one man, Dominic Carrera, 40 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair like war medals earned too young. Dominic was the kind of man whose silence could empty a room faster than a gunshot. He stood 6 feet 2 inches of controlled danger, broad shoulders that had carried empire after empire, dark eyes that calculated everything and felt almost nothing, and a jaw set so permanently hard that people whispered he had never truly smiled in his adult life. Not once. Not genuinely. He owned Carrera Tower. 52 floors of black glass and steel, rising from the heart of Ravenna like a monument to everything he had crushed beneath him. The building's name was etched in gold letters at the entrance, his name, his brand, his declaration to the world. The 48th floor was his alone, a private office suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking every corner of the city he controlled. On clear nights, you could see all of Ravenna from those windows, the docks where his shipments came in, the restaurants and hotels that laundered his money, the police precincts where his men sat behind badges, the courthouses where his lawyers made problems disappear. He did not merely own property in this city. He owned the city itself. And he knew it. Every morning, Dominic stood at those floor-to-ceiling windows with a cup of black coffee. Never sugar, never cream, because weakness came in many forms and he refused them all. And he looked down at Ravenna like a king surveying a kingdom that owed him everything. He had built this. He had bled for this. He had buried people for this. Every street corner, every trembling shopkeeper, every whispered negotiation that happened in back rooms with dim lights and locked doors, all of it answered to him. His empire ran through legitimate businesses and criminal networks with equal precision. Carrera Enterprises was a legitimate real estate conglomerate on paper, hotels, commercial properties, construction contracts. But beneath that polished surface ran rivers of darker money, protection rackets, weapons smuggling through the port district, narcotics distribution managed through a labyrinth of shell companies so complex that 3 separate federal investigations had collapsed trying to untangle them. Dominic had not built this empire by being reckless. He had built it by being patient, precise, and utterly without mercy, when mercy would have cost him something. He had no wife. He had had one, years ago, Elena, with her dark eyes and her laugh that used to make him feel like a man instead of a machine. But that was before the empire consumed everything soft inside him. Elena had left when Dominic was 31, taking nothing but their daughter, Sophia, who was now 8 years old and lived in Florence with her mother and a new man who coached football on weekends and came home for dinner every night at 6. Dominic sent money. He sent expensive gifts. He did not send himself, because he did not know how to be present without also being terrifying, and he loved Sophia enough to spare her that. So he was alone.
And he told himself it was by choice.
On the 48th floor, there was a rhythm to everything. His staff of 30 operated with military precision, meetings scheduled to the minute, reports delivered before he asked for them, problems solved before he learned of them. No one was late. No one was unprepared. No one made the mistake of looking him in the eye for too long, because in Dominic Carrera's world, prolonged eye contact was either a challenge or a plea, and he had patience for neither. The office was cleaned every night between 10 and 11 p.m. after Dominic had gone home to his penthouse 3 blocks away. It was a simple arrangement. The cleaning staff came in through the service elevator, did their work, and left without a trace of themselves. Dominic never thought about them. They were furniture to him, useful, necessary, utterly beneath his notice. He had never learned any of their names. He had never thought to ask. On the night that everything began to change, though Dominic would not know it had begun for a very long time, he was still in his office at 10:15 p.m. He had forgotten about a call with a contact in Rotterdam, and the call had run 40 minutes over schedule, which meant he was still sitting at his desk when the service elevator doors opened and the cleaning crew arrived. He did not look up. He heard the quiet sounds of the crew moving through the outer rooms, the faint hiss of a spray bottle, the soft bump of a cart, the barely audible sound of movement. Professional silence. He approved of it abstractly, the way you might approve of well-oiled machinery. And then one of them entered his office. He still did not look up. He was reviewing documents, a pen moving rapidly across a contract page, his mind entirely elsewhere. But something made him pause. Not a noise, not a disturbance, but the absence of both. Whoever had entered was so quiet, so entirely unobtrusive, that his senses, finely tuned by decades of survival instinct, registered her presence the way you register a held breath. He looked up. A young woman stood across the room with her back to him, wiping down the shelf that held his awards and framed photographs. She was 29 years old, though he did not know that. She was small in frame, with dark hair pulled back tightly, wearing the gray uniform that all the cleaning staff wore. A uniform designed, it seemed, to make its wearers as invisible as possible. She moved with quiet efficiency, each motion careful and deliberate, as though she knew exactly how much space she was allowed to occupy in the world and had chosen to occupy slightly less. She had not noticed him. Or perhaps, and this thought did not occur to him until much later, she had noticed him perfectly well and had simply decided not to perform surprise. "You," Dominic said. She turned. Her eyes were dark brown, steady, and utterly calm. Not frightened. Not flustered. Just calm. "I apologize, Mr. Carrera," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear. "I was told the office would be empty by 10. I can come back." He stared at her for a moment, not because she was remarkable to him, but because something in her stillness was unusual. Most people trembled slightly in his presence. It was a biological response, involuntary, the body recognizing danger even when the mind tried to override it. This woman simply stood there, composed, patient. "Finish your work," he said, and looked back down at his documents. She turned back to the shelf without another word. He forgot about her before she left the room. Her name was Nadia Reyes, and she had been waiting 3 years for this exact moment. Nadia Reyes had not always known how to be invisible. There had been a time, a bright, loud, wonderful time, when she had been the most visible person in any room she entered. Not because of beauty, though she had that too, but because of her mind. She had been the kind of student that professors remembered decades later, sharp, relentless, possessed of a memory that cataloged everything, and a brain that connected patterns the way other people connected dots. She had graduated top of her class from the University of Ravenna's Business School at 22, with 2 scholarship awards and a thesis on corporate shell structures that her economics professor had quietly told her was the most sophisticated student work he had read in 20 years. She had been going to change the world. Or, at minimum, she had been going to build something beautiful in it. Her father, Marco Reyes, had run a small shipping company in the port district of Ravenna for 30 years. Not a glamorous business, container logistics, freight documentation, third-party brokerage for smaller import businesses that couldn't afford the big players. But it was honest. It was his. He had built it from a single rented warehouse and a second-hand truck, and by the time Nadia was in university, Marco Reyes Shipping employed 22 people, owned its own small fleet, and had established a reputation in the port district for reliability and integrity that was worth more than any glossy advertisement. Marco was the kind of man who knew every one of his employees by name, who sent flowers when their parents died, who closed early on the day of the city football final so his staff could watch the game. He was 61 years old with rough hands and a soft heart, and he was the most important person in Nadia's world. And then Dominic Carrera decided he wanted the port district. It had not been personal, Nadia understood that now, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent years studying exactly how it happened. Dominic had been expanding his legitimate real estate holdings along the waterfront, consolidating properties to build a luxury development that would triple the value of the district and provide a new avenue for financial operations. Marco Reyes Shipping sat on a prime waterfront lot. The company was small enough to be pressured, large enough to be worth acquiring, and Marco Reyes was honest enough to be destroyed by dishonest tactics. The campaign against her father had been methodical and invisible, which was how Dominic always worked. First came the inspections. Suddenly, after 30 years of clean operations, the port authorities found violations. Documentation irregularities. Safety concerns. Fines that were small enough to seem legitimate, but large enough to begin bleeding a small company's reserves. Then came the contract withdrawals. Clients who had worked with Marco for a decade suddenly, apologetically, took their business elsewhere. No explanations. Just gone. And then came the loans. Marco had taken a business loan 2 years earlier to expand the fleet, and somehow, quietly, that loan was acquired by a Carrera-linked holding company, and the terms were called in early, in full, on 30 days' notice. Marco Reyes had not understood what was happening to him. He was an honest man dealing with what looked like very bad luck arriving all at once. He had not known about shell companies or waterfront consolidation strategies, or the particular way that Dominic Carrera dismantled small businesses that occupied spaces he wanted. He had simply watched his life's work collapse around him, tried everything he knew to stop it, and failed. He had died of a heart attack 6 months after losing the company. Nadia had been 25 years old. She had held her father's hand in the hospital room as the monitors flatlined, and she had felt something shift inside her. Not break, not shatter, but harden. Like something soft that goes into a furnace and comes out as steel. She had not screamed.
She had not collapsed.
She had sat very still in the chair beside his bed, and in the silence of that room, she had made a decision so clear and so complete that it felt less like a choice and more like a fact she was simply recognizing. She was going to dismantle what had been done to her father. Not with violence. She had no interest in violence. Violence was how frightened people operated, and she was not frightened anymore. She was focused. She would use the only weapons she had ever trusted: her mind, her patience, and her complete willingness to be underestimated. The next 4 years had been the hardest of her life, and also, in a strange way, the most clarifying. She had spent the first year researching. Not visibly. She had done it carefully, quietly, building her understanding of Carrera Enterprises from public filings, court records, property documents, financial disclosures. She had filled notebooks that she kept in a locked box under her bed. She had taught herself things that her business degree had touched on but not completed: corporate law, financial forensics, offshore holding structures, the particular ways that legitimate real estate empires and illegitimate financial networks could be interwoven so thoroughly that pulling one thread would unravel both. She had learned everything. And then she had gone to work at Carrera Tower. Not as herself, not as Nadia Reyes, the brilliant daughter of the man Dominic Carrera had destroyed, with her business degree and her notebooks full of his financial secrets. She had gone as a cleaner. She had applied through a third-party facility management company that held the contract for Carrera Tower's building services, using a reference from a cousin and a resume that showed 3 years of hotel cleaning work. She had worn her hair back. She had kept her eyes down in the interview. She had been quiet, efficient, and utterly forgettable. She had been assigned to the 48th floor. For 3 years, she had cleaned Dominic Carrera's office 4 nights a week. For 3 years, she had been invisible to him, present in his space, breathing his air, moving through the rooms where he made decisions that destroyed people like her father, and he had never once looked at her as though she might matter. She had found that useful, because while she cleaned his office, she was also building her own. She had started small, investing what little she had saved into micro-positions in undervalued waterfront properties that she had identified through her research as adjacent to Carrera's consolidation targets. She had done it through a series of small shell companies registered in her college roommate's grandmother's name, companies so modest and so carefully structured that they attracted no attention whatsoever. She had partnered quietly with two investors she had met through a business networking group, a retired banker named Horace Kim who trusted her instincts because he had seen what her mind could do, and a property developer named Sylvia Marchetti who had her own reasons to want Carrera's grip on the waterfront loosened. 3 years.
4 nights a week.
Gray uniform. Eyes down. While the man who had destroyed her father looked through her like glass. She had never forgotten why she was there. Not for a single moment. Over those 3 years, Nadia had come to know Dominic Carrera in a way he would never have imagined possible, not through conversation or confrontation, but through the intimate knowledge that comes from being trusted to be invisible in someone's most private space. She knew that he worked later than anyone on his staff. The evidence was always there, coffee cups multiplied through the evening, the particular scatter of documents across his desk that suggested a man who needed to stay busy to avoid confronting the silence. She knew that he kept a photograph in the bottom drawer of his desk, visible only when he left it partially open, which happened perhaps once every 2 weeks. She had never looked at it directly. That would have been a violation of something she couldn't name, but she had seen enough to know it was a small girl, gap-toothed and laughing, with her father's dark eyes and none of his hardness. She knew that some nights, very late, he stood at the window for a long time without moving, and the set of his shoulders in those moments was different from his boardroom posture, less armored, more tired, like a man carrying something heavy who occasionally forgot to pretend he wasn't. She had not softened toward him. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own heart. What she noticed about his solitude was useful information, not sympathy. A man who felt nothing could not be reached. A man who felt something, even if he locked it away, even if he had forgotten what to do with it, was a man whose foundations were not entirely stone. She filed these observations the same way she filed everything, quietly, precisely, without sentiment. There had been moments of danger, small moments that required all of her composure to navigate. Once, 18 months into her time at Carrera Tower, she had been working late because a spillage in the outer corridor had required extra attention, and Dominic had returned unexpectedly from a dinner that had ended early. She had heard him in the corridor before he entered, and she had stood very still beside the window, not hiding, because hiding would have been suspicious, but simply being exactly what she was supposed to be, a cleaner finishing her work, unremarkable, unthreatening. He had entered the office, glanced at her, looked away. His face had been tighter than usual, some tension from the dinner, she assumed. He had gone directly to his desk and poured 2 fingers of whiskey from the decanter on the credenza, and he had stood there drinking it with his back to her, staring at the window. "You can go," he had said, without turning around. "Yes, sir," she had replied. And she had gathered her supplies and left, her heartbeat perfectly steady. The second moment had been more difficult. It had been a Tuesday evening, 8 months ago, when she had arrived on the 48th floor to find Dominic conducting what was clearly the end of a difficult meeting. 2 men she recognized as mid-level associates, men whose names appeared in her notebooks in connection with the Port District operation, were leaving as she arrived, and they were leaving unhappy. One of them, a heavy-set man named Gallo, had nearly walked into her cart at the elevator entrance, and had responded to this by looking her up and down with contempt and saying something so degrading that the other man laughed. Nadia had said nothing. She had looked at the floor. She had stepped aside. Dominic had been in the doorway of his office. He had watched this exchange. He had said nothing either, and that silence, she had noted, was a choice he made, and she had filed it precisely where it belonged. But here was the thing about those 3 years that Nadia had not entirely anticipated. The work itself had also been transformative in ways that had nothing to do with her plan. Not because of Dominic. Because of herself. The discipline required to maintain her invisibility, to be in that building, in that office, so close to the man whose decisions had killed her father, and to move through it with perfect composure night after night, had forged in her a quality she had no previous name for. It was beyond patience. It was beyond endurance. It was something like complete command of herself. Every part of her that had ever been impulsive, reactive, raw with grief, she had hammered it down and rebuilt it into something functional and precise. She had become, in some essential way, unbreakable. And the empire she was building in the shadows of his empire had grown beyond what she had originally imagined. Horace Kim had connected her with 3 additional investors once her first 2 property acquisitions had shown the returns she had projected. Sylvia Marchetti had brought in a lawyer, a sharp, discreet woman named Agnes Park, who had helped Nadia structure her holdings with a sophistication that rivaled anything in Carrera Enterprises' legal architecture. Slowly, carefully, Nadia had been acquiring waterfront properties, retail blocks, and, most importantly, the smaller debt instruments and holding structures that connected, through a chain she had spent 3 years mapping, to the foundations of Carrera Tower itself. Not all of Dominic's empire was as solid as it appeared. The tower, the great gleaming monument with his name in gold letters, was leveraged. Not catastrophically, not obviously, but leveraged against a web of financial instruments that Nadia had spent years learning to read. There were pressure points. There were moments in the refinancing cycle where the right acquisition, the right consolidation of related debt, could create a situation that left the tower vulnerable to a transfer of control, not through seizure, not through force, but through the clean, legal, utterly unstoppable mechanism of financial architecture. She had spent 2 years building the bridge to that moment. She was almost there. On the last night she ever cleaned Dominic Carrera's office, she stood at the window he always stood at and looked out at the city below. Ravenna in the late-night hours, the lights of the port district, the glow of the waterfront, the streets that had been her father's streets and were now, piece by piece, becoming hers. She did not feel triumph yet. She felt something quieter than that. She felt ready. The morning the transaction closed, Nadia was wearing a white shirt and dark trousers. Not a gray uniform. Not a cleaning cart. Not the uniform of invisibility she had worn for 3 years. She was sitting at a mahogany conference table on the 32nd floor of a different building entirely, the offices of Park and Associates, where Agnes Park had assembled the legal and financial team that had spent 6 months executing the final phase of a plan that had taken 4 years to build. Around the table were people who knew exactly who Nadia Reyes was. Horace Kim sat to her left, 71 years old and silver-haired, with the quiet satisfaction on his face of a man who had bet on an underdog and watched them become something magnificent. He had been the first person outside her own heart to believe in what she was doing, the first person she had allowed into her real story, with her notebooks and her research and the full map of what she intended, and his faith in her had never wavered once, not even in the hardest months when the financial architecture required moves that looked like overreach. Sylvia Marchetti was across the table, 54 years old, a self-made woman who had clawed her own way up through Ravenna's property market and had no love for the men who used the city's criminal networks to squeeze out legitimate competitors. She had brought capital. More importantly, she had brought credibility. Her name on the consortium gave it the air of a legitimate property investment group, which was precisely the point. Agnes Park sat at the head of the table, documents arranged before her with a precision that matched Nadia's own. She was 48 and brilliant, and had twice been offered partnership at larger firms and twice had declined because she preferred to choose her clients rather than inherit them. She had chosen Nadia because, she had said quietly over coffee 6 months ago, in 30 years of practice, she had never seen a 29-year-old build a financial case this airtight. The final acquisition, the piece that completed the bridge Nadia had been constructing, had been the consolidation of 3 debt instruments connected to the Carrera Tower's underlying financing structure. These instruments had passed through multiple hands over the years in ways that Dominic's team had likely tracked at inception, but stopped monitoring when they flowed into the kind of small, quiet holding vehicles that large organizations simply do not consider worth watching. Nadia had spent 18 months patiently acquiring all three through the consortium, never in amounts large enough to trigger attention, always through intermediaries, always through Agnes's meticulous legal architecture. When all three were consolidated in the consortium's hands, a refinancing condition in the original tower development agreement, a condition written 12 years ago by lawyers who had never imagined it would ever be invoked, gave the consolidated debt holder the right to initiate a controlled transfer process if certain conditions were met. Nadia had met every condition.
Precisely. Completely.
Legally. Agnes slid the final document across the table. Nadia looked at it for a moment. The language was dense and technical, pages of it, but she had read every word 6 times already. She knew what it said. She knew what it meant. She uncapped her pen, and her hand was completely steady, and she signed her name on the line. Nadia Reyes. The same name that appeared in none of Dominic Carrera's records. The name of the daughter of the man he had never thought about once in the years since he had dismantled everything that man had spent his life building. The name of the woman who had cleaned his floors for 3 years and been invisible and used every single moment of that invisibility to build this. Agnes Park collected the signed documents with a small, precise smile. "It's done," she said. And the room was quiet for a moment. Then Horace Kim reached over and covered Nadia's hand with his. His eyes were bright. He said nothing for a moment, the kind of man who understood that some moments were larger than words, and then he said, very quietly, "Marco would have been so proud." And that was when Nadia cried. Not dramatically, not loudly. 2 tears, maybe 3, that she pressed away with the back of her hand quickly and completely. But they were real. They were for her father, for his rough hands and his soft heart, for the flowers he sent when his employees' parents died, for the 30 years of honest work that had been taken from him by a man who simply wanted the waterfront lot and never thought for a moment about what was built on it. She composed herself within seconds. She was, by this point, extraordinarily good at composing herself. "What happens next," she said, "has to be handled exactly right." Agnes nodded. "The notification process is managed through the registered agent. Carrera's legal team receives formal notice today by courier and electronic delivery simultaneously. By law, he has 48 hours to review and respond, but there is nothing to respond to. The transaction is complete and fully compliant. The notice is purely procedural. How soon before he understands what it means? His lawyers will understand within an hour of receiving it. Dominic himself." Agnes paused, choosing her words carefully. "How quickly he understands it will depend on how carefully he has been monitoring the instruments in question. If his team has been paying attention, he may already know something is wrong. If not, the letter will be his first indication." Nadia thought about this. She thought about the man she had watched standing at his window in the late hours, shoulders carrying something he never put down. She thought about the photograph in his desk drawer of a little girl with gap-toothed smile. She thought about her father's hands. She thought about the moment this had all begun. A hospital room, a flatlined monitor, a decision that had hardened inside her like steel in a furnace. "There's one more thing I need to do," she said. She reached into the leather portfolio in front of her and produced a letter. Handwritten. 3 pages, both sides, in her small, careful script. She had been writing it in fragments for 4 years. "This goes with the formal notice," she said. "Not as a legal document. As a personal one." Agnes looked at her. "Are you certain?"
"He needs to know why," Nadia said.
"Not because I need him to understand, but because my father deserves to be named." Dominic Carrera received the courier at 2:17 p.m. He was in the middle of a meeting when his assistant Marcus stepped in, which Marcus never did, under any circumstances, which meant that whatever was in his hand was significant enough to override a rule that had stood for 6 years. Dominic clocked Marcus's face before he spoke. The man was pale, and his jaw was doing the thing it did when he was trying to control information his body was already broadcasting. Dominic dismissed the meeting without explanation. He took the envelope. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a dense legal package, 40 pages of formal notification, transaction records, and certification of transfer. He read the executive summary first, then the key terms, and then he sat very still for approximately 60 seconds in the way that he sat still when something required him to reprocess his entire understanding of a situation. Carrera Tower. His tower. His name in gold letters on the entrance of the building that stood as the monument of everything he had made himself into. The tower no longer belonged to him. Control had transferred, through an entirely legal, thoroughly bulletproof financial mechanism, to a consortium headed by a company called Reyes Capital Group. He did not recognize the name. He set the legal document aside and picked up the second item in the envelope. It was not a legal document. It was a handwritten letter, 3 pages, in small, careful script. He looked at the signature first, the way he always looked at the bottom of any document before reading it, a habit formed by decades of knowing that who was speaking mattered more than what was said. Nadia Reyes. He did not recognize the name. He began to read. Mr. Carrera, you don't know my name. You've never known my name, though you've been in the same room with me hundreds of times. I cleaned your office for 3 years, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday nights, between 10 and 11 p.m. I was the woman in the gray uniform. I moved quietly. I didn't disturb you. I expect you remember me the way you remember any piece of furniture you've decided is beneath your attention. My name is Nadia Reyes. I am 29 years old. My father was Marco Reyes, who owned Marco Reyes Shipping in the Port District for 30 years. I don't expect you to remember him either. I imagine he was one of many small problems that your organization resolved efficiently on the way to acquiring the waterfront block in 2019. I've spent 4 years reconstructing exactly how it was done, the inspection irregularities, the contract withdrawals, the loan acquisition, and early call. It was professionally executed. I want you to know that I studied it carefully because I learned a great deal from understanding exactly how you work. My father did not understand what was happening to him. He was an honest man, and he dealt with it the way honest men deal with things. He kept trying to work harder, to solve the problems through effort and good faith, because that was the only framework he had. He lost his company, his savings, the work of his entire life. He had a heart attack 6 months later. I held his hand when he died. He was 61 years old. I want to tell you about him because you should know who he was. He knew every one of his 22 employees by name. He sent flowers when their parents died. He closed early on football final days so his staff could watch the game. He had rough hands because he had started the business himself, with a rented warehouse and a second-hand truck, when he was 31 years old, your age, more or less, when you were busy building something very different. He worked 30 years for something honest, and you took it in 18 months because you wanted the waterfront lot, and he was in the way. He never knew your name was behind it. I think that might be the part one find hardest. I want to be clear about something. I did not build what I've built in order to destroy you. I have no interest in your imprisonment or your ruin. That's a different kind of project, and it's not mine. What I built because the city you believe you own contains people whose lives and work have value, and I wanted to demonstrate that in the most direct way I could conceive. I spent 3 years cleaning your office so that I could understand your operation from inside it. I spent 4 years building a financial structure that could reach the foundation of yours. I did it legally, carefully, and completely.
I want you to understand that.
Not because I need your acknowledgement, but because I want you to know that the same intelligence you overlooked, the same patience you mistook for passivity, the same woman you looked through like glass, that is what built this. Carrera Tower is now the first building of what will become a community development initiative in the Port District. the same district you hollowed out when you finished acquiring it. The proceeds from the building's operations, after costs, will fund a trust in my father's name for small business support in Ravenna. It seemed appropriate. I don't hate you, Mr. Carrera. I want to be honest about that because it would be easier in some ways if I did. But I've spent 4 years getting to know you in the particular way that comes from watching someone closely when they don't know they're being watched. I know you stand at your window at night carrying something you can't put down. I know you have a daughter you love from a distance because you don't trust yourself not to harm her with your proximity. I know that the hardness you've built into yourself is a choice you made young and have been paying for ever since. I don't hate you. I don't pity you either. I just needed you to know that my father existed. That what was taken from him was real. That someone kept count. The building is mine now. I suggest you begin moving your operations by the end of the month. Nadia Reyes, Capital Group. Dominic read the letter once. Then he read it again. Then he set it down on his desk and he sat with his hands flat on the surface in front of him and he stared at the city through his floor-to-ceiling windows for a very long time. He did not call his lawyers. He did not call Marcus. He sat alone in the silence of an office that was no longer his, in a tower that was no longer his, and he read the name Marco Reyes in his mind over and over again like a man trying to remember something that should never have been forgotten. Rough hands. Flowers for grieving employees. A second-hand truck when he was 31. Something moved in his chest that Dominic Carrera had not felt in a very long time. It felt, he thought, like the thing you feel in the moment before you understand something you cannot ununderstand. 31 days later, Dominic Carrera walked into the lobby of Carrera Tower for the last time. He had been legally required to vacate his personal office suite and complete the transfer of all business operations by the end of the month. His lawyers had spent the full 30 days looking for a mechanism to challenge the transaction, every angle, every possible weakness in the legal architecture, and had come back to him with the same answer each time, expressed with increasing discomfort. The transaction was valid. The financial instruments had been properly acquired. Every condition of the original refinancing agreement had been met. The transfer was complete and irreversible. There was nothing to challenge. He had already moved his operations to a temporary office in one of his other properties. Carrera Enterprises had plenty of real estate, the irony of which was not lost on him. The 48th floor had been vacated by his staff over the past week. The offices emptied and cleaned and handed over through an administrative process his lawyers had managed so that Dominic himself would not have to be present for it. But he had come back today. He had needed to. He did not examine that need too closely. He simply acknowledged it and came. The lobby was different already. Small but unmistakable changes. The reception desk had been rearranged. The Carrera Enterprises signage on the wall had been removed, leaving a pale rectangle where it had hung for 12 years. In its place, workmen were installing something new. He paused to watch, and then he stood very still. The new sign read, Reyes Community Development Center. Beneath it, in smaller letters, in memory of Marco Reyes, 1958 to 2020. Built with patience. Given with love. He stood in the lobby of the building that had his name in gold letters on the outside and read the name of the man he had not remembered, and he felt the thing in his chest from the letter. That particular feeling, like the moment before you understand something you cannot ununderstand, expand into something larger and more uncomfortable. He heard footsteps. He turned. She walked in through the main entrance with Agnes Park on one side and Horace Kim on the other, and she was wearing a dark blazer over a white shirt, her hair down for the first time he had ever seen, or for the first time he had ever noticed. He corrected himself, because he understood now that most of his observations about her had been willfully incomplete. She had a leather portfolio under one arm, and she was speaking quietly to Horace, something that made the older man smile. She saw Dominic immediately. She had expected him to be here.
She stopped.
The three of them stopped. The lobby held that particular quality of charged silence that precedes either collision or something else. Dominic looked at her for the first time, as though she were fully present. She was 29 years old, and she had the dark eyes and the composed face that he had registered once as unremarkable because he had not been paying attention, and it was very clear to him now, in this lobby, in this moment, that he had been wrong about almost every assumption he had made about her. The stillness he had registered 3 years ago and dismissed as passivity was not passivity.
He could see that now.
It was the stillness of someone who had perfect control of themselves because they had needed that control and had built it deliberately over a long time. She walked toward him and stopped 2 meters away. "Mr. Carrera," she said. Her voice was the same, quiet and clear. "Ms. Reyes," he said. There was a pause. Around them, workmen continued their work with practiced indifference. "I read your letter," he said. "I know." Several times. She said nothing. She waited with that particular patience that he now understood was not simply temperament but practice. Years of practice, developed in the hours she had spent in his office, when he had looked through her. "Your father's name," Dominic said. "Marco Reyes."
He paused.
"I looked him up. After I read the letter. His company, his history. The Port District operation." He stopped again, and something passed across his face that was not his usual expression, something that looked unfamiliar on him, as though muscles were moving that had not been used in a long time. "I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't think I've earned the right to ask for it." Nadia looked at him steadily. "I wasn't offering it," she said quietly. "I wasn't withholding it either. What I wanted was for you to know his name. You know it now." "Yes," he said. "I know it." Another pause. Horace Kim was watching this exchange with the expression of a man witnessing something he would think about for the rest of his life. Agnes Park was looking at her documents. "What happens to this building?" Dominic said. "The community center. The trust in his name." He looked around the lobby slowly, at the new sign with Marco Reyes' name on it. "You built all of this," he stopped. "Started again. You were in my office. For 3 years. 4 nights a week," she said. "And I never—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "No," she said simply. "You never did." It was not said with cruelty. It was said with the same precision she brought to everything, accurate, complete, and entirely without embellishment. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when there is nothing to add to a true thing. "The work you did," he said at last, quietly. "Your father would have—" He stopped himself. "I'm sorry. I don't have the right to speak about what your father would have felt." Nadia was quiet for a moment. "He would have said," she said softly, "that honesty is always worth more than a tower." Dominic stood in the lobby of the building he no longer owned, and he said nothing, and for once, the silence was not armored. 6 months after the transfer of Carrera Tower, the Reyes Community Development Center opened its doors to the Port District. Nadia stood at the entrance on the morning of the opening, not in a gray uniform, not in a dark blazer, but in a dress the color of early morning, her hair down, her face open in a way it had not been in a very long time. Beside her was Horace Kim, beaming with an uncomplicated pride that she had come to depend on as one of the steadiest things in her world. Sylvia Marchetti had arrived early and was already inside, directing caterers with the particular focused energy of a woman who treated every occasion as a project to be executed well. Agnes Park was standing near the entrance in her immaculate coat, exchanging quiet words with a city councilwoman who had quietly supported the development initiative and was now that it had become something real and visible, very publicly enthusiastic about it. The lobby where Nadia had stood face-to-face with Dominic 6 months ago, was transformed. The pale rectangle where Carrera Enterprises signage had hung was now a mural, commissioned from a local artist from the Port District, depicting the waterfront as it had been 30 years ago. Small businesses, fishing boats, families, the particular texture of a working neighborhood that had been slowly hollowed out by the forces of money and power. It was beautiful and honest and a little heartbreaking, and Nadia had stood in front of it alone for 20 minutes the day it was completed, and she had felt something she had not expected. Not triumph. She had thought it would feel like triumph. It felt like completion. It felt like a circle closing, not dramatically, not with a crash, but with the quiet, solid sound of something being set down carefully after being carried for a very long time. The Marco Reyes Small Business Trust had already received 47 applications in its first week open. Small businesses from the Port District and surrounding neighborhoods, a bakery, 2 logistics companies, a family-owned restaurant, a small tech repair shop run by a 23-year-old who had grown up in the district. The trust offered low-interest capital, mentorship connections, and legal support for businesses that were too small to afford the protections that large organizations took for granted. Nadia had structured it specifically for businesses like her father's, honest, modest, built on effort and integrity, exactly the kind of business that had no protection against the particular tactics that had been used to destroy Marco Reyes. She had also done something that she had debated for weeks. She had written, in the trust's founding documents, a provision: any business that could demonstrate it had been harmed by predatory practices in the Port District in the 5 years prior to 2020 could apply for restitution support. It was not a legal mechanism. It could not compel anyone to pay anything, but it was a formal acknowledgement that harm had been done, that it had been real, that it deserved to be named and, where possible, addressed. 22 of her father's former employees had received letters from the trust the previous month. Not large amounts of money. The trust was not a reparations fund. It was a support fund, but acknowledgments, connections, references. 3 of them had come to see her in person. One had been Miguel, who had driven for her father's fleet for 9 years and who had not found stable work since the company folded. He had sat across from her desk in her building, and he had looked at the name on the door, and he had said, quietly, "Mr. Marco would have loved this." She had needed a full minute before she could respond. Now she stood at the entrance of the building on opening day, and the city was beginning to arrive. Not the city of fear and power, not the city of Dominic Carrera's gaze from the 48th floor. The real city. The Port District city. Families and shopkeepers and fishermen and small business owners and young people who had grown up in the neighborhood and had never had a reason to feel that something in this city was working for them rather than against them. She shook hands and smiled and answered questions and listened, truly listened, in the way she had learned to listen, the way she had learned to be present in a space and take everything in, and all morning she felt the weight she had been carrying for 4 years become lighter and lighter until, by midday, she realized she had stopped carrying it entirely. It was still there in another form. Her father was still gone. That would never change. The grief of it was not cured by any amount of justice or financial architecture or community trusts. It was simply the fact of losing the most important person in your world, and it would live in her always. But it was no longer pressing. It was no longer driving. It had become something she could carry gently rather than urgently, something she could hold as love rather than as an open wound. Marco Reyes existed. He had always existed. Now, the city knew his name. She had not heard from Dominic Carrera since the day in the lobby. She had not expected to. She had not needed to. Whatever that man did with the understanding she had handed him, the letter, the name, the full weight of what his choices had cost, was his to carry and his to reckon with. She had done what she came to do. She had named her father. She had built something in his honor. That evening, after the opening reception ended and the last guests left and the staff began clearing up, Nadia went upstairs alone. Not to the 48th floor. That floor was being converted into co-working and training space, stripped of its former identity and given a new purpose. She went to the 21st floor, which had a terrace, and she stood outside in the evening air and looked out at Ravenna. The Port District lay below her, lit with the ordinary lights of ordinary lives. The docks where her father's trucks had once loaded and unloaded. The streets where he had walked. The city that had been too large to protect him. She breathed. She thought about the gray uniform and the cleaning cart and the 4 nights a week and the 3 years of being invisible and every moment she had stood in that office alone, and reminded herself why she was there. She thought about her notebooks in the locked box, and Horace Kim's steady faith, and Agnes Park's meticulous precision, and Sylvia's energy and Maria's grandmother's name on old documents, and the day she had signed her real name on the transaction papers and felt her hand was completely steady. She thought about what her father used to say, an old saying he had borrowed from somewhere and made his own, something he used to tell her when she was small and the world felt too large and too hard. Be patient with the slow work of good things. She thought, She thought, it worked. Below her, the city moved through its evening, ordinary and imperfect and full of people trying to build small, honest things in a world that was not always kind to that. People like her father. People who deserved more protection than they had. People who were easy to overlook if you were the kind of person who looked down from towers and saw real estate instead of lives. She was not that person. She would never be that person. And the tower with his name in gold letters on the outside and her father's name in the lobby and 47 applications from small businesses in the trust's first week. The tower stood behind her, and it was hers, and she had earned it in the slowest and most complete way imaginable. Not with fear, not with power, not with the machinery of intimidation that had taken everything from Marco Reyes. With patience, with intelligence, with a grief that she had refused to let break her and instead had let shape her into something harder and better and more purposeful than she had ever known she could be. With love, because everything she had done, every notebook, every night in the gray uniform, every careful legal structure and quiet financial move had been an act of love. Love for her father. Love for the idea that honest work had value and that the people who destroyed it should not simply get to keep what they took. The city was beautiful from this height. Not because it was perfect, because it was real and she was in it and she was still standing and she had not been invisible for a very long time. Nadia Reyes stayed on the terrace until the stars appeared above Ravenna, and she let herself feel all of it. The grief and the love and the completion and the particular bittersweet joy of finishing something that took everything you had, and then she went back inside. She had work to do. She always had work to do. And for the first time in 4 years, that felt not like urgency but like purpose. Like a life worth waking up for. Like her father would have wanted.